The horse who had given up stood motionless in the auction ring, her once proud neck now bent in defeat, as if the very effort of holding up her head had become too much to bear. Dull eyes, sunken into a gaunt face, gazed at nothing in particular, seeing neither the crowd nor the handlers who had roughly dragged her forward as the day's final lot. Her brown coat, which might once have gleamed with health, hung from her skeletal frame like a shabby blanket, revealing each rib in stark relief against the hollow of her belly. Fresh wounds peppered her flanks and shoulders, mingling with the pale lines of old scars that told a story of prolonged neglect and casual cruelty. The countryside auction barn smelled of dust, hay, and quiet desperation. On that cold autumn afternoon, slanting golden light filtered through grimy windows, illuminating the motes that danced in the stale air. The crowd had thinned considerably as the day wore on, leaving only the serious buyers, weathered farmers in flannel shirts, horse traders with calculating eyes, and a handful of meat buyers lounging at the back wall, their expressions impassive as they jotted numbers in small notebooks. The auctioneer's voice had grown hoarse, his earlier enthusiasm worn down to mechanical efficiency. He cleared his throat, his practiced patter faltering as he searched for something positive to highlight. "Brown mare," he announced flatly. "About 7 years old, starting bid at 200. Silence answered him, broken only by the shuffle of boots on the sawdust-covered floor. 150, he tried again, his eyes scanning the sparse crowd. 100. A few rows back, the meat buyers began a hushed conversation, calculating price per pound against transport costs. One nodded slightly at the auctioneer, who seemed relieved to have any interest at all. $75. "We have 75. The auctioneer called, voice lifting with manufactured enthusiasm. "Any advance on 75? The mare shifted slightly, causing a fresh trickle of blood to seep from a wound on her hind quarter. For just a moment, she raised her head, her vacant gaze sweeping across the faces of those who saw her as nothing more than a collection of pounds, a problem, or a lost cause. From the entrance doorway, movement disrupted the scene. A man in a charcoal suit stepped into the dusty arena, conspicuously out of place among the denim and flannel. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his lined face suggesting 50 years of a life far removed from this rural auction house. His polished shoes were entirely wrong for the straw-covered floor. As he made his way closer to the ring, studying the mare with an intensity that silenced the room. In that searching gaze was something the others had missed. Not what the horse was, but what she could be again. Without hesitation, he raised his hand. $500, he stated, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet auction hall. Some broken things call to others, their silent pain, recognizable only to those who carry similar wounds. James Harrison stood apart from the murmuring crowd as the auction staff processed his payment, their curious glances bouncing off his expensive suit like raindrops on polished stone. His manicured hands seemed foreign against the rough wooden counter as he signed the transfer papers, the gold fountain pen incongruous in the weathered surroundings of the rural auction house. Executive Vice President of Harrison Financial Group, the embossed business cards in his wallet, spoke nothing of horses or country properties or impulsive rescue missions. The auctioneer approached with poorly concealed bewilderment, his earlier indifference replaced by deferential confusion. $500 for a mare barely worth the meat on her bones had disrupted the natural order of things. James answered the man's unspoken questions with cool efficiency, arranging for temporary transport to his property, 30 miles outside the city, a 10-acre retreat purchased 3 years earlier when his cardiologist had used phrases like stress reduction and lifestyle changes with alarming frequency. As auction workers struggled to load the reluctant mare into a borrowed stock trailer, James felt the weight of stares from the dispersing crowd. The horse buyers saw an amateur, a city fool easily parted from his money. The meat buyers saw interference in an established food chain. None could see the flashes of recognition that had sparked when James first glimpsed those vacant equine eyes. The same emptiness that had greeted him from his bathroom mirror each morning after Elizabeth had packed her things and left a note on monogrammed stationery, explaining how 22 years of marriage had become collateral damage to his corporate ambition. The mare balked at the trailer ramp, her skeletal frame trembling visibly. Watching her struggle, James felt the first prickles of doubt penetrating his impulsive decision. His country property had a small stable, remnants of the previous owner's equestrian aspirations, but those stalls had remained empty during his occasional weekend retreats from the suffocating demands of the financial world. He knew boardrooms and balance sheets, not feed ratios or veterinary care. 3 months had passed since his collapse during the quarterly shareholders meeting, since the ambulance ride and the sterile hospital room, where monitors had tracked each stressed beat of his overworked heart. 3 months of medication adjustments and mandatory therapy sessions, where the psychologist had encouraged meaningful connection outside the corporate sphere. Find something that matters beyond the bottom line, she had suggested, her voice fading into the white noise of his carefully constructed world. Now, watching handlers finally coax the terrified animal up the metal ramp, James wondered if he had exchanged one impossibility for another. The mare's defeated posture mirrored his own spiritual exhaustion, her physical wounds matching his invisible ones. As the trailer doors clanged shut, the magnitude of his commitment suddenly loomed before him like an unexpected mountain on what he had thought was familiar terrain. Trust reveals itself in the smallest of gestures, or its complete absence. The brown mare stood frozen in the far corner of the paddock, her body pressed against the wooden fence as if trying to melt through it to escape. 2 days had passed since James had watched the trailer pull away, leaving him alone with a traumatized animal and an increasingly clear understanding of his own inadequacy. The fresh hay he had awkwardly spread remained untouched. The water trough, filled and refilled with clean water, showed no signs of having been approached. The mare existed in a state of suspended animation, her eyes tracking his movements from a distance, her muscles tensing visibly whenever he drew nearer than 20 feet. Morning sunlight spilled across the small property, illuminating the rolling 5 acres of pasture that stretched behind the modest farmhouse. The weathered red barn, with its 3-stall stable, had seemed charming when James had purchased the weekend retreat 3 years earlier, an impulsive antidote to 60-hour workweeks and the sterile silence of his downtown penthouse. Now it felt like an ill-fitting costume, his designer loafers collecting mud as he made another futile attempt to approach the mare with a handful of oats. Dr. Sarah Klein arrived precisely at 9, her beat-up truck announcing itself with a sputtering engine that echoed across the quiet countryside. Her weathered jeans and practical canvas jacket stood in stark contrast to James's pressed slacks and cashmere sweater. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, took in the situation with professional assessment. The untouched food, the trembling horse, the businessman clearly out of his depth. The examination that followed was a careful dance of approach and retreat. Dr. Klein moved with practiced patience, explaining each step in a low, steady voice, meant more for the horse than for James. Even so, sedation became necessary before she could properly assess the mare's condition. The verdict, delivered in clinical terms that failed to mask the underlying horror, painted a picture of systematic cruelty, malnutrition, untreated infections, improperly healed fractures, and evidence of repeated beatings with what appeared to be chains or heavy rope. As she packed her medical supplies and drafted a treatment plan on her clipboard, Dr. Klein's skepticism about James's ability to handle such a case was evident in her pointed questions and doubtful glances. The recovery would be long, she explained, months, not weeks, and the psychological damage might prove permanent. Without asking why a businessman in designer clothes had purchased a broken-down auction horse, she provided detailed instructions for wound care, feeding schedules, and medication administration. That evening, as golden light bathed the paddock, James approached the still sedated mare, with a small apple in his outstretched palm. Standing beside her, closer than she had allowed when conscious, he studied the network of scars that mapped a history of human betrayal across her dulled coat. The name came to him unbidden, whispered into the quiet evening air. Hope, not for what she was, but for what she might become, for what they both might become. Patience has its own silent language, spoken in stillness and consistent presence, rather than words or demands. James sat on an overturned bucket in the corner of the paddock, his tailored trousers collecting dust as he read aloud from the quarterly earnings report. The morning sun warmed his shoulders as his voice moved methodically through profit margins and market projections, the corporate jargon incongruous against the backdrop of swaying grass and distant bird song. 2 weeks had passed in this daily ritual, James sitting, reading, existing in the same space as Hope without expectation or approach. 2 weeks of following Doc Klein's meticulous care instructions, leaving food and retreating, cleaning wounds from a distance permitted only when the mare seemed too exhausted to resist. Hope remained in her corner, maintaining the maximum possible distance between them. But something had shifted subtly in her posture. Her head no longer hung quite so low, and occasionally her ears would flick toward the sound of James's voice, tracking the cadence if not the meaning. The wounds across her flanks had begun to heal, angry red lines fading to pink beneath the antibiotic ointment James applied during her brief moments of tolerance. The prominent ridge of her spine and ribs remained stark against her dull coat, but daily, incrementally, her intake of grain and hay increased. It happened on the 16th day, as James read through projections for Asian markets, his mind only half engaged with the words on the page. A soft shuffle of movement pulled his attention upward. Hope stood 15 feet away, closer than she had ever willingly come. Her head was slightly raised, nostrils flaring gently as she took in his scent. James remained perfectly still, his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and throat, as the mare took another hesitant step forward. Then another. Time suspended itself in the quiet paddock as horse and man regarded each other, neither retreating from this new, fragile proximity. With movements so slow they barely disturbed the air between them, James extended his hand, a small apple resting on his open palm. Hope's ears flicked forward, then back, her body tensing as instinct warred with emerging trust. Minutes stretched into a small eternity before she extended her neck, keeping her body at maximum distance, while her lips gently, tentatively, took the offering from his hand. The simple acceptance reverberated through James, with unexpected force, collapsing the careful compartments he had built between his corporate existence and this new rural reality. His vibrating phone lay forgotten in his jacket pocket, his business partner's third call of the morning going unanswered. The quarterly management review scheduled for that afternoon seemed to belong to another lifetime, another person. The pressing deadlines and demanding clients that had once defined his days now felt distant and somehow less substantial than the brown mare, cautiously retreating to her corner, the apple a small treasure carried gently between her teeth. That evening, for the first time since purchasing the property, James did not return to his city penthouse. He called to reschedule meetings indefinitely, citing personal matters, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man recognizing a fundamental shift in his center of gravity. Knowledge without experience is merely information, while wisdom is born from both. James stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, watching the battered pickup truck navigate the final curve toward his property. Dr. Klein had provided the name reluctantly, warning that Lucas Mercer rarely took on clients and preferred his solitude to social niceties. Her description had painted a picture of a man as broken as the horses he rehabilitated, a former champion trainer who had retreated from the equestrian world following a tragedy no one discussed openly. 3 phone calls had gone unanswered before James had driven to the remote cabin himself, standing on the weathered porch for nearly an hour before the bearded man had emerged, irritation evident in every line of his sun-weathered face. The truck came to a stop, dust settling around its mud-spattered frame. Lucas stepped out, his movements economical and deliberate. He wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt patched at the elbows, his calloused hands bearing the evidence of physical labor. James's corporate life had never demanded. Without greeting or preamble, Lucas walked directly toward the paddock, where Hope grazed at a cautious distance from the fence line. James followed silently, conscious of the disparity between his pressed chinos and the horseman's practical attire. For nearly 30 minutes, Lucas observed the mare without approaching or commenting, his eyes tracking her movements with a precision that reminded James of his company's most ruthless financial analysts. When he finally spoke, his assessment was delivered in sparse, unvarnished terms. The mare had been systematically broken, not just physically, but in spirit. Her recovery would require more than medical treatment and kind intentions. It would demand a complete re-education in what humans could be, a rebuilding of neural pathways shaped by pain and fear. The training sessions began the following day. Lucas arrived at dawn, his expectations as clear and immovable as the horizon. James found himself demoted to apprentice, following instructions with the same attentiveness he had once demanded from junior executives. Together they established a routine of predictable interactions, approaching from consistent angles, using specific vocal cues, creating patterns Hope could anticipate rather than fear. Lucas demonstrated proper grooming techniques, his hands steady and sure as he guided James through motions that became a wordless language between human and horse. In the quiet spaces between instructions, fragmented details of Lucas's former life emerged. Competitions won, students mentored, articles published in equestrian journals James had never heard of. The horseman spoke more freely to Hope than to James, murmuring observations and encouragements as he worked. Yet a tentative bridge formed between the two men. James recognized in Lucas's withdrawn demeanor echoes of his own post-divorce isolation, while Lucas seemed grudgingly impressed by the businessman's willingness to abandon his polished appearance and manicured nails in service to the rehabilitation work. Weeks passed, marked by incremental progress. Hope now accepted, grooming without trembling, took treats gently from an outstretched hand, and allowed herself to be led across the paddock on a loose lid rope. Each small victory was celebrated with quiet satisfaction. Between the unlikely partners, the corporate executive and the reclusive trainer, their differences diminished by their shared investment in the brown mare's recovery. Fear leaves indelible memories that sleep beneath the surface until awakened by familiar triggers. The storm rolled in just after midnight, an early summer tempest that transformed the peaceful countryside into a chaos of howling wind and slashing rain. James woke to the sound of thunder cracking like a whip across the sky, followed immediately by a piercing whinny that cut through the downpour. He stumbled onto the porch and hastily pulled on boots and rain jacket, flashlight beam wavering wildly across the paddock, where Hope's dark silhouette thrashed against the wooden fence posts, her body rigid with primal terror. By the time James reached her, she had already ripped through the top rail, her shoulder streaming with fresh blood that mingled with the rain. Her eyes reflected his flashlight in twin orbs of pure panic, unseeing, locked in some remembered horror that the storm had resurrected. When he approached, she reared with explosive force, striking out against phantoms only she could perceive. The progress of weeks evaporated in seconds as Hope reverted to the terrified creature from the auction ring, her body language screaming of betrayal and abuse. Dawn revealed the extent of the damage. Dr. Klein's tight-lipped assessment cataloged the injuries clinically: a deep laceration along the shoulder, torn muscles, a possible re-injury to the previously healed right foreleg. The sedated mare lay on a bed of straw in the stable, her breathing shallow and rapid even in sleep. The weeks of patient rehabilitation had been wiped away in a single night of terror. The trust painstakingly built now shattered by triggers they'd never anticipated. Lucas arrived without being called, somehow knowing through that inexplicable horseman's intuition that his expertise would be needed. For 3 nights, the men took alternating shifts beside Hope's stall, administering medications and changing bandages according to Dr. Klein's instructions. During the long midnight hours, the barriers between their disparate worlds thinned and dissolved. Lucas spoke of his daughter Emma, a promising young rider killed during a competition when her horse, startled by unexpected fireworks, had thrown her into a jump standard. He described his subsequent self-destruction and eventual salvation through working with traumatized rescue horses, finding redemption in helping animals others had abandoned. In the confessional darkness of the stable, James found himself speaking of things long buried, the child he and Elizabeth had lost in the second trimester, the way he had thrown himself into 60-hour work weeks rather than face the grief, the slow dissolution of his marriage beneath the weight of unspoken pain. The corporate armor he had constructed now seemed as transparent and fragile as Hope's initial recovery. As the mare's physical wounds began to heal, James recognized that her setback had illuminated his own incomplete recovery. Each gentle touch he offered, Hope became a wordless apology to himself for years of neglected emotional wounds. Each patient hour spent rebuilding her trust became a step toward his own healing. Guided by Lucas's weathered wisdom and the silent honesty of the injured horse who had nowhere to hide from her pain, and thus showed him the courage to face his own. Healing rarely happens in isolation. Despite our stubborn insistence on self-reliance, the first unexpected visitor arrived on a Tuesday morning as James was cleaning Hope's stall. A weathered farmer from down the road who introduced himself with a brief nod before offering practical advice about the proper way to mix molasses with grain for weight gain. He left behind a salt lick and decades-old wisdom about horses with troubled minds, as he called them. By Friday, an elderly woman appeared with a jar of homemade salve her family had used for generations on injured livestock. The following week brought a retired veterinary assistant who spent an hour demonstrating specialized wound cleaning techniques, her gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle on Hope's healing shoulder. What had begun as isolated visits soon transformed into a steady trickle of rural neighbors, each bringing something to contribute: practical knowledge, hand-me-down equipment, or simply the gift of experienced eyes. Assessing Hope's progress, the local feed store owner began setting aside damaged bags at half price, delivering them personally on his way home each Thursday. A teenage girl arrived on her bicycle 3 times weekly, spending hours patiently brushing Hope's coat to a gradually increasing shine, while telling the mare elaborate stories about school and friends and everyday drama. James observed this unexpected community with bewildered gratitude. In the corporate realm, he had engineered mergers and directed multinational teams, yet always from a position of carefully maintained distance. Authority required separation. Influence demanded a certain isolation. Here, as his designer wardrobe gave way to practical jeans and work shirts, as his manicured hands developed calluses from mucking stalls and carrying feed buckets, he discovered connection without hierarchy. These people cared nothing for his executive title or investment portfolio. They measured him solely by his commitment to the broken mare and found him, surprisingly, worthy of their collective wisdom. Most remarkable was Lisa, an equine massage therapist who arrived unannounced after hearing about Hope from a client. Her skilled hands worked miracles on Hope's damaged muscles, releasing tension from the mare's body that medications couldn't touch. Under her ministrations, Hope's eyes would half close in tentative relaxation, her initially rigid posture gradually softening as Lisa worked. The mare, who once recoiled from human touch, now leaned into it, discovering that contact could bring relief rather than pain. Hope's physical transformation accelerated with this expanded circle of care. Her ribs gradually disappeared beneath healthier flesh. Her coat developed patches of genuine shine. Her eyes lost some of their haunted vacancy. More profound was the psychological shift. The mare, who had existed in perpetual high alert, began showing curiosity about her surroundings, nickering softly when James entered the stable, extending her nose to investigate visitors rather than retreating in fear. On a golden afternoon in late summer, James stood at the paddock fence beside Lucas, watching Hope trot across the enclosure with an almost playful energy. The reclusive trainer nodded toward the small group of neighbors gathered for their informal weekly progress assessment. their faces reflecting shared investment in Hope's recovery. In their expressions, James recognized something his wealth had never purchased, and his corporate achievements had never earned: the simple, profound connection of shared purpose, of communal commitment to healing what had been broken. Time reveals transformation in layers, each day building imperceptibly upon the last, until suddenly, the cumulative change becomes impossible to ignore. Autumn painted the countryside in amber and crimson. As Hope cantered across the paddock, her movements fluid and unburdened, bearing no trace of the hobbled creature who had arrived 6 months earlier. Her coat gleamed mahogany in the slanting light, her once protruding ribs now covered by healthy muscle, her eyes bright with an awareness that tracked birds overhead and followed the movements of squirrels along the fence line. Most remarkable was her changed response to human presence, not just tolerance but active engagement, ears pricking forward at the sound of familiar voices, nickering greetings offered freely rather than extracted through patient coaxing. In the peaceful routine they had established, James would arrive at the stable each evening. As the day cooled toward dusk, Hope would meet him at the gate, her head extending over the top rail, nostrils flaring gently to confirm his scent, though her eyes had already recognized his approach. She accepted grooming with evident pleasure now, leaning into the currycomb, as James worked loose hair from her gleaming flanks, occasionally nudging his shoulder with her muzzle in what could only be described as affection. The scars remained visible beneath her coat, permanent reminders of cruelty that had once defined her existence, but they no longer dictated her responses or limited her capacity for trust. When the call came from his business partner, James recognized the crisis demanded his physical presence in the city. The potential collapse of their largest merger, tensions among board members, accusations of mismanagement in his absence. Such concerns would have consumed him entirely a year earlier. Now he packed an overnight bag with reluctance, explaining his unavoidable departure to Hope, as though she might comprehend the complexities of corporate responsibility. Lucas promised to maintain her care schedule precisely, understanding the importance of consistency for a horse still rebuilding her sense of security. 3 days stretched into 5, as James navigated the corporate emergency, his tailored suit feeling like costume armor after months in practical work clothes. Each evening, Lucas sent brief updates: Hope healthy, Hope eating well, until the 4th night, when his message carried an observation that pierced through James's business concerns with unexpected force. Hope had spent an hour at the gate around sunset, the time James typically arrived, her attention fixed on the driveway with evident expectation. She had returned the following evening, standing vigil at precisely the same time, waiting for arrival that didn't come. When James finally returned, driving through early morning mist that clung to the rolling pastures, he found Lucas already at the stable. The trainer described without sentiment how Hope had maintained her nightly watch, a behavior he'd observed in only the most bonded horses, those capable of anticipation, attachment, and the particularly painful emotion of disappointment. As if confirming his assessment, Hope approached James with unusual energy, her greeting more demonstrative than ever before, her examination of his familiar scent and form surprisingly thorough, as if confirming his wholeness after absence. Standing in the stable that evening, the corporate crisis resolved, but other decisions still pending, James studied Hope's transformed presence. Her evident peace, her capacity for joy despite her scars, her willingness to risk connection after profound betrayal. In her recovery, he recognized a template for his own. The resignation letter took shape in his mind, not as surrender, but as commencement, the beginning of something authentic that the horse had helped him rediscover, one patient day at a time. Redemption creates ripples that extend far beyond the original healing. The county fairgrounds bustled with activity as James led Hope from the trailer, her ears pricked forward with interest rather than flattened in fear. The Community Rescue Showcase had drawn dozens of organizations, each with stories of animals saved and rehabilitated, each offering education rather than judgment to the gathered crowds. Hope walked beside James with relaxed confidence, her gleaming coat and healthy weight bearing no resemblance to the skeletal creature who had stood trembling in the auction ring. Nearly a year before, children approached with outstretched hands, and the mare who once recoiled from human touch now lowered her head gently to accept their tentative pats, her eyes soft and patient as tiny fingers explored her velvet muzzle. The small booth James had arranged displayed simple before and after photographs, the first showing Hope as she had arrived, emaciated and wounded, the second capturing her as she now stood, restored in body and spirit. Visitors paused to read the accompanying story, many shaking their heads at the evidence of cruelty, others nodding with recognition of their own rescue experiences. Lucas moved among the crowd with uncharacteristic sociability, answering questions about rehabilitation techniques, his expertise no longer hoarded in isolation, but shared freely with anyone who showed genuine interest in horse welfare. The encounter came unexpectedly, as James demonstrated how Hope now accepted touch on previously sensitive areas. A heavy-set man stopped abruptly before their station, his weathered face registering disbelief as he recognized the mare. The transformation had rendered her nearly unidentifiable from the broken animal he had once owned. Yet something in her stance triggered his memory. His presence triggered something in Hope as well, a momentary tension quickly replaced by calm confidence. As she pressed closer to James, her trust in her new handler overriding old fear responses, rather than the confrontation James might once have chosen. With the righteous anger of the corporate litigator he had been, he instead invited the man to observe Hope's transformation up close. He explained the rehabilitation process in methodical detail, the veterinary treatments, the specialized feeding program, the psychological reconditioning. He described the community that had formed around one horse's recovery, the resources mobilized, the knowledge shared. Education rather than accusation became his most powerful response. By spring, the Harrison Equine Rehabilitation Foundation had taken shape on James's expanded property. 4 new paddocks housed recently rescued horses in various stages of recovery. The renovated barn included a small education center where Lucas conducted weekly workshops for prospective adopters and volunteers. Corporate skills found unexpected application as James navigated nonprofit regulations, fundraising strategies and volunteer coordination. His former business partners, initially bewildered by his career change, had become the foundation's most significant donors. Hope remained the heart of their operation, the living embodiment of their mission. Potential adopters who questioned whether traumatized horses could truly recover found their answer in her gentle presence. Volunteers who grew discouraged by seemingly hopeless cases found inspiration in the before and after photographs that now hung in the main office. Children from local schools visited regularly to learn about animal welfare, sitting cross-legged in the education center as Hope demonstrated groundwork exercises with the calm dignity of a natural teacher. On quiet evenings, James often stood at the paddock fence, watching Hope grazing peacefully alongside newer rescues. The journey from the broken mare at the auction to this confident, balanced animal mirrored his own transformation from isolated executive to connected community member. In saving her, he had found himself, each step in her healing showing him the path toward his own wholeness. If this story of rescue and redemption touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of healing and hope. Every subscription helps us continue sharing these stories of second chances. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.